Mm-hmm.
I think that the Republican Party is like 2 elections away from being completely irrelevant. We see a new party growing up to be the opposition party, and that's the Social Democrats, AOC from Standing Rock. A barista at Standing Rock to Congress, leading the children to the Sunrise Movement and to Nancy Pelosi's office to demand a Green New Deal. That happened like so quickly, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
This is the beauty of living in a time of immense confusion and chaos, is that change happens like at quantum leaps, quantum leaps.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing that the whole edifice is crumbling, as Joanna Macy and everybody always told us it would. And unfortunately, that's going to take down a large part of the global economy, and that's going to be very painful as well.
Yeah.
But out of that rubble, we already, as Joanna again, as she's been going around for her whole adult life, we have to not be discouraged by the edifice above, but rather build the structures, the eco-resilient structures at the ground level, and have the ideas ready so that when the time comes, we can step forward into a new future together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This is part 2 of a 2-part series of conversations with Dharma-driven activist Zhiwa Woodbury, who's speaking to us about hope, about trauma, and about Planetary Hospice. Just about everybody's feathers should be ruffled in this conversation. Help me welcome, for round 2 of Zhiwa Woodbury. Well, thank you for sharing about that, and I hope it's welcome for me to say congratulations to you for being able to transition and let that go and move into the next, I'm sure, extraordinarily fruitful chapter of life. And I'm wondering, do you mind if I just ask a bit about, I already, I'm moved, and I don't want to spend time here, but I'm so appreciating that brief summary that you gave about what you're seeing is the current state of affairs that we've evolved ourselves or devolved ourselves into, in terms of standing for the commons, standing for Earth in terms of our legal system and so on. I'm curious if there's anything that you could tell us about that is at all inspiring, at all offers some sense of forward movement or movement in a good way to connect otherwise deep adversarial populations, like the different sides of these legal issues that you've been working. I'm just curious, as you look back over your career, and especially recently, is there any good news to relay? Is there anything that kind of gives you a little bit of reassurance of some of the goodness of human beings in this in this challenging time?
My inspiration, and the reason that I kept doing it, is the people that at the local level of forests and deserts and prairie lands that care so much about wildlife, nature, and their local bioregion. And so they haven't given up. Maybe, I'm giving up because I feel called to do something else, right? But I've always made sure that like, I have younger attorneys that I've trained that are better than me, continuing on the fight. They're determined to continue that fight. The help they need is basically blue tsunami. I mean, we have to. What's interesting right now, right, is that they the DNC, again, this relates to this whole idea of something has shifted. The DNC said, no, you can't have Bernie, and that
Right.
that maniac James Carville was screaming on TV, oh, America lost its mind, and all this kind of. So no, you can't have Bernie, and you're going to have to take Uncle Joe. And since then, like all of the circumstance, all the circumstances are forcing all of the proposals that Bernie was spearheading, was the figurehead for, healthcare, education, Green New Deal, reparations, forcing sort of all of that onto Joe Biden, right? So if this social movement continues to build and coalesce, get the coalescence right now of, well, it can't really happen in the streets because we're gonna be having more outbreaks with the pandemic. So I don't think that we have to stay in the streets the whole time, but we have to continue organizing the whole time and we have to force these solutions on government, because they're not going to give them to us unless we demand them. Free healthcare. How could you not give free healthcare to African American communities in particular, who have like a 6.2% mortality rate, 3 times what you and I would have, or the white people have, mortality rate from COVID? How could you not respond right away by saying, look, you have free testing, whatever it takes, we're going to take care of you. Don't worry about crushing finances and bankruptcy. They didn't do that. So, but now it seems like people are just mad as hell, ain't going to take it anymore. And even though, I've always been cynical or a critic of the Democratic Party, which is kind of like my father's Republican Party, the truth is that circumstances overcoming them, and they can't seem to defend their tried and true sort of reforms and the way they've done things in the past. So if that builds to November and we transform Washington D.C. by making the Republican Party irrelevant, basically, then believe me, we'll be coming forward with all kinds of legislative proposals and demands for putting the departments of government in the hands of the people that care about people and places, like Department of Interior, Forest Service, all those kinds. Like, we can change that overnight, right? And that's what the Green New Deal is really a framework for doing, along with, and once the Green New Deal, so we have to do this. I mean, we don't need Bernie, right? Thanks for everything you did in raising the consciousness, but we've got this now. It's kind of like that. And so reparations and Green New Deal and all that next year, right? The year of the biodiversity convention coming up for renewal as well, with the One Earth proposal. We can transform this really quickly with the best and the brightest minds coming forward that have been marginalized for my whole life. And that's what needs to happen, is recognizing that those are our oppressors. And now they have to listen to us, because the situation is what it is, especially if we end up in a depression, just like with the New Deal, out of chaos and misery, people start caring about each other. And so all the circumstance seems to be conspiring in that, in making that long arc of justice finally kind of hit the ground. and and I know, I'm convinced we could go in and rewrite a lot of the laws overnight. And I was going to say, so the Green New Deal, once we have that framework in place, then the biodiversity conventions, we have a way of implementing them. The biodiversity conventions basically meaning rewilding, restoring the grasslands of the Midwest with bison, all of the sciences, we know how to do this, and it's just a matter of changing our relationship to the land and to wildlife, to reflect what Gaia needs in order to help us draw carbon out of the atmosphere, right? So it's actually quite exciting if you look at all of the science. If you just focus on the Arctic is melting, it's really depressing.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
It is. If you just focus on fossil fuels, it looks completely hopeless, right? If you look at everything that's happening, the social movements, the social justice, the David Brooks writing about reparations in the New York Times, that
Yes.
it's time for reparations, and actually having good ideas. Like that's a lifelong Republican guy,
Yeah.
So I think what we're seeing, I'll give you like I told you, we have a moral obligation to be optimistic, right?
Yes.
What I see happening is that the Republican Party is dying in front of us in real time. That Trump is going to go down in history as the greatest president because he alone will be the one who brought down the entire Republican Party. And we will dance on his grave, when he ever gets buried, because Hillary was not going to do that for us, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that the Republican Party is like 2 elections away from being completely irrelevant. We see a new party growing up to be the opposition party, and that's the Social Democrats, AOC from Standing Rock. A barista at Standing Rock to Congress, leading the children to the Sunrise Movement and to Nancy Pelosi's office to demand a Green New Deal. That happened like so quickly, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
This is the beauty of living in a time of immense confusion and chaos, is that change happens like at quantum leaps, quantum leaps.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing that the whole edifice is crumbling, as Joanna Macy and everybody always told us it would. And unfortunately, that's going to take down a large part of the global economy, and that's going to be very painful as well.
Yeah.
But out of that rubble, we already, as Joanna, again, as she's been going around for her whole adult life, we have to not be discouraged by the edifice above, but rather build the structures, the eco-resilient structures at the ground level, and have the ideas ready so that when the time comes, we can step forward into a new future together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? If you look at the big picture, all of that's happening. And and it's just, of course, it can always go both ways. History is not necessarily linear. So, but being an optimist about it is like, yeah, I can see us having a conversation a year from now going, wow, we thought things were changing radically week to week during the COVID crisis. Look what happened over the last year. Hopefully we'll be having that conversation a year from now. And we'll be on the road to recovery from the climate crisis finally.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to actually book some time with you somewhere in the vicinity of October-ish, because I have this strong amount of my attention on this next presidential election, and all the elections that are going on at that time. And you have that extraordinarily apt perspective, that multidimensional perspective that I'd love to check in with you and just, let's get a pulse on it then, and then we can look forward to meeting again later in 2021. I'm curious, as we start to wrap this up, Zhiwa, we were talking about before we started recording about your many writings that have been really moving for me, really bringing, just like the conversation today, bringing us a particular honed in focus and context, much needed context to so many issues. And two that really come to mind that I'd just like to bring up and ask for you to perhaps finish up with some thoughts of context for this. So two areas that I've had the pleasure of speaking with you about in our previous conversations with the summits that Carolyn Baker and I put on and so on. One was about grief and actually your substantial work around Planetary Hospice. So that's one piece that I'd like you to weave for a moment. And the other one is the intersection of both individual and collective trauma. And what I'm asking about is, we're speaking out to an audience that, it's really very few people who have a lot of facility with being able to integrate a wholesome and nourishing relationship with grief, and have some sense of what is this notion of planetary hospice? Like, how can I shift my presence and my relationship with Earth itself and with life itself in such a way that it could be hospice? How could that be a forwarding and a positive framing and for life? And then with trauma, I'd say even fewer people have any kind of an awareness of just how much trauma there is in the undercurrents of all of our lives, going back many generations and also very currently still primarily suppressed. And so I'm curious if you have any suggestions, any thoughts that could help someone who doesn't know much about these two things. Why would they want to have more awareness of them? And how might they be able to be gentle with themselves to become more aware and to start moving toward some healing, towards at least some heightened awareness, and then possibly some healing and some way of integrating these into our experience in a way that doesn't just cripple us further. Do you have anything that you'd inspired to say?
Yeah, you ask such simple questions.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, get ready for a 60-minute answer.
Okay, I'll break it up into two parts. We'll be good.
Okay. So let me start here. Everybody dies, and everybody loses loved ones. And the hospice movement has changed the way we relate to, we're a death-phobic and grief-phobic culture, and we have been since the end of World War II. And the hospice movement that began in the 60s, along with a lot of other things that began in the 60s, really had a profound effect on our relationship to death and dying, thanks to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who, by the way, was famous for the 5 steps of grieving, and her co-author and co-researcher in that process has a new book coming out this month, I believe, where they add the the sixth stage of grieving, which is meaning. Once you get to acceptance, the fifth stage, then you build meaning out of that. So that's kind of where we're heading, way down the road on climate, or even the COVID crisis. So here's the secret about hospice. My primary training in hospice was in San Francisco, with Zen Hospice, which was famously started by Sundru Suzuki in response to the AIDS crisis back in the 80s. And so they have amazing experience in dealing with death and dying. And the secret of hospice is that there's just as much joy and laughter as there is tears and sadness. And it's all basically about being human. But it's, yeah, mostly the 5 hours a week that I would go into hospice were the happiest 5 hours weeks of my life, because when you spend time with people who are dying, they don't put up with any bullshit. There's no pretense. There's no, it's just real. They demand that you be real. That's the beauty of hospice, yeah? Or being invited into somebody's dying process. Okay, so you started out by talking about all the work I did on Planetary Hospice. The truth is that when I started writing a book that ended up being Climate Sense, about sort of cultural grief, I started out writing the book about Planetary Hospice, but I decided, or it was apparent to me not long into that writing process, that people weren't ready for Planetary Hospice yet, culturally. And so I put that on the back burner. And actually, with my legal career ending, I finally started writing that book. So before I wrote about, cultural grief and so forth, but not really about Planetary Hospice. That book remains to be written. And of course, it encompasses a lot of the work on trauma and everything that I've done. But what became, okay, so when the COVID crisis, the COVID pandemic hit, all of a sudden, the paper Planetary Hospice, which is available online, went viral again. And that's what it took to actually, for me to realize, I was like, whoa, like that's interesting. And then I went, oh, this is Planetary Hospice. And what do I mean by that is that what's different between being in hospice and being in society up till now is that there's a death awareness when you're in hospice. Everybody has the awareness of death, and that any of us, because you never assume that people in hospice are going to die before you, because you could get in an accident on the way home from the hospice, right? So you become very aware everybody becomes very aware of death, and death is present, something that you can deny, and then it becomes kind of liberating. Well, the COVID crisis, especially the first couple of months before we went into this weird bargaining stage, what was different was that all of a sudden there was a death awareness everywhere. Everybody, was acknowledging that I could lose my parents this year if I still had parents, or I could catch this virus and die just by walking out the door. So all of a sudden, we were all living in hospice. To me, that's the heart of hospice. And so that's a really beautiful thing, because once you stop being in denial about death and mortality and how fragile life is, then you're in the right mind to talk about how fragile the planet is, how fragile all life is, right? So I feel like we're kind of out of that right now, but it was very instructive to everybody. I don't think we're quite as death phobic as we were before the world ended in February, the world we knew.
Right.
And so now that the other thing about that is that it gives you more resources or makes it easier to acknowledge trauma, and both historic and epigenetic or generational trauma, as with slavery and genocide, cultural trauma that embodies, all levels of trauma are related to each other. So we have a culture that, you were talking, I think, about culture of death or cult of death, culture. Um, uh, and it's very apparent now. Everybody sees that. And I think we're even going to start at some point questioning, well, we are questioning the idea of endless war, especially fighting over oil. These wars think about this. America has historically been the world's policeman.
Mm-hmm.
And now everybody's saying, do we really need police?
You're right. Yeah.
The next level up from what we're talking about at
Right.
the level of our cities and nationally is, do we really need to be the world's policeman? And are we not kneeling on the neck of the global South and Mideast, Mideast, South America, Africa? Are we not kneeling on their neck, and are they not gasping for life, telling us they can't breathe? And aren't they actually speaking for the planet itself, with our predatory dominant ways, the oppressors of the world, meaning corporate America, because it's corporations that are controlling our rulers, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And it's the police that have been, the militarized police is so obvious, are representing them and not us. And, and since when did, the whole idea about militarized police, my goodness,
Yeah.
who are they at war with? Right? So all of that is just coming into question now. And I think that that we're ready to acknowledge the connection between war and a ridiculous Department of Defense spending, spending $10 trillion to replace our old nuclear weapons with new nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Even though we assume, there's nothing it's not like the old nuclear weapons wouldn't destroy the world still, right?
Yeah.
That's what we're spending $10 trillion on in a time of climate crisis, really? or $4 trillion, pumped into the corporations out of the treasury or banks or whatever in response to a pandemic.
Yeah.
Okay, this is what's all coming up for review, and thank God we have things like Zoom and everybody's talking. Everybody is at a death cafe. It's like a global death cafe, and we're like, gee, is this really who we are? Is this who we really want to be? Or can we be something? Isn't it time that we actually grew up and became something better,
Mm-hmm.
and actually live up to our own ideals and stuff? So I think that brings everything back. Everything comes back down to the individual level. We don't exist. The pandemic has made it so clear that we are totally interdependent. We are one species, and and one planet, and intimately connected with nature, et cetera, et cetera. We have to bring that down and recognize that the path of recovery from climate trauma, which is the trauma that's triggering all the other traumas, the path of recovery is to acknowledge it, acknowledge that these are all connected, and then come into proper relationship. That's what you do. You can't heal or recover from trauma by yourself. And there's There's no such thing as by yourself anyhow anymore. So you have to at least you
Yeah.
have to at least come into proper relationship with yourself, which is a self acknowledging that you don't exist, and you actually have a relationship with yourself. So there's at least two people there. You have to come into proper relationship with your families and in your communities, and then among countries, culturally. We all have to come into proper relationship with people of different ethnic backgrounds, and ultimately coming into proper relationship with the natural world. That's what we're being asked to do. That's why it's a crisis, because that relationship was completely out of whack.
Yeah.
So Mother Nature, who's a much more intricate living organism than we are, we're mere cells in her, well, you and I can say, are mere cells in her autoimmune system, who are being activated to come to her defense because her organs are starting to fail, right? But we're like cells in that large organism which has its own intelligence. And this whole thing with the COVID pandemic is such a mild reproach from our mother for how bad we've been, but it's at the same time it is just a first wave. You know, she has for the first time shared with us her symptoms. It's not psychological for us anymore. It's not just geophysical. It's not about the weather. We're feeling we are also at threat of elevated temperature and attack of our respiratory system and our organs breaking down and us dying. We're all feeling that now.
Yeah.
That trauma I've been saying for all along, her trauma is our trauma. Now we feel it. And so ultimately, we have to come into proper relationship with her. And that begins again with coming into proper relationship with ourselves, which is why Pope Francis said in Laudato Si, the climate crisis is asking us what it means to be human. That's a question each one of us has to consider on our own in order to be able to answer the question collectively. And we do that through awareness, whatever your spiritual practice is. And if I could share one sort of spiritual practice to you know, I seem to be instructing people, you have to do this. So how do you come into proper relationship with yourself and Gaia and everything in the timeline that we have, which is urgent? And so I want to, you know, I've been a Buddhist for many lifetimes, but I'm not going to, but everybody has like their own spiritual practice. But the one thing we can all spiritual practices agree on is that that breath is life. You know, breath is what connects us to everything. And from a yoga standpoint, it's body, mind, breath. Breath is the bridge between the body and the mind. And we all know what nowadays, we all know what mindfulness means. You know, mindfulness was taught by the Buddha 2,500 years ago. Is just follow your breath. Just follow your breath. The mind will follow breath, you know, and that centers you. But we live in a trauma sphere now. When the Buddha was alive, life was pretty pastoral and pretty kind of low tech and not at the pace that it is now, right? And so mindfulness is great, especially for people that have the privileged life and have the time to develop that practice. It's very important. It's the central teaching of the Buddha. So I'm, you know, as a Buddhist, you know, I'm going to acknowledge that. But there's another way of dealing with trauma with our breath. And it's proven through neuroscience to be effective in releasing trauma. And what I'm talking about in this exercise is the trauma of everyday life, which is what you were talking about at the beginning, right? How do you release the trauma of everyday life when I'm feeling triggered and I'm feeling like this? Okay, you sit down and you center your posture with your spine so and all the energy channels are open.
Mm-hmm.
So you sit in and then you deepen your breath. So mind follows breath, right? So first you slow your breathing down, which slows your mind down. And then you deepen your breathing, which allows you to access deeper realms of the mind. And you say, oh, this is how much air my lungs actually can take. Because our default level of breathing is shallow, which is shallow breathing, which is associated with trauma. So we actually reflect the trauma sphere in our default mode of breathing, and it's hard not to feel distracted and everything when we're in that sort of default mode of thinking and living, just going through the motions or whatever. As soon as you start deepening and expanding your lungs, you feel your heart you feel more connected to your heart. Then you start coming out, you start changing your awareness. Okay, and awareness is actually the prescription for trauma. The way you resolve trauma in a therapeutic session is by bringing awareness to it. The way we are addressing cultural trauma of misogyny is by bringing awareness to the Me Too movement. The way we're dealing with the trauma of slavery is bringing awareness to Black lives. So this is what we're doing culturally. We have to do it individually, or we can do it individually. So you start changing your awareness. And here's the part about releasing trauma. Once you have that slow, deep cycle of breath going, you pause at the top and you pause at the bottom. So it's called box breathing because it's roughly a four-sided type of breath instead of just up and down like linear breathing. Okay, and so when you pause at the top, you think that you just inhaled, you just filled your lungs and you're inspiring, all the energy and sort of you connect with the larger consciousness. And then you releasing all the anxiety and stress and trauma of everyday life and down into the earth. When you get to the bottom of your lungs and the bottom of your breath, you pause there. And I'm not saying hold your breath, because that's a different thing. I'm saying pause without cutting off your esophageal, right? So keep the breathing open. But you pause at the bottom and you ground into the earth. Okay, this releases trauma, which induces a higher level of awareness, or a more general kind of awareness. That awareness is embedded in the awareness of culture. It's embedded in the awareness of Gaia, the organism of which we are a part. And she actually, interestingly enough, the electromagnetic sphere of Gaia, the organism that she generates, is 7.82, the Schumann frequency, 7.82, I think, hertz or cycles per second, which is in our brain on an oscilloscope. It's the level of meditation, memory, and intuition. So if you focus on that awareness, if you become aware of that awareness that you induce with box breathing, it's no longer just your awareness. And that's where intuition, that's where inspiration can come from. That's where you feel the presence of your mother. earth because she's there. That's where all my writing comes from.
Mm.
I don't make these ideas up like on a chalkboard. They come up into me or through me on the cushion, and then I faithfully transcribe them.
Yeah.
I didn't invent climate trauma, planetary. I mean, you know what I mean? It's just like I've opened myself up to that, and I acknowledge that. And you know, plant medicines is sort of the same process, only much more dramatically. You know, people who are feeling called to do plant medicines, that's Gaia, that's her mycelium, that's her brain neuron structure or whatever that you're plugging into. And then you plug into that and you go, oh my God, she's way more intelligent than we are. Oh my God, she's
Yep.
not just real, she's like amazing. It's
Yep.
awe-inspiring. Okay, so this, you know, we're just talking about breathing, and like Thomas Hubel says, who is an expert on working with trauma in group settings, deep, you know, deep trauma, like the trauma of the Holocaust. He says, slow your breathing down and truth has a chance to emerge. And that's what he's talking about, is like getting out of our mental distraction into the sort of blue sky of awareness that is other than self, which is Buddha, Anatman, other than self. That's what sustains me. That's what allows me to keep things in perspective and not lose my mind. I mean, the reason I started meditating was because I was losing my mind. And the reason I keep meditating is because I don't want to lose my mind. I'm quite happy with my mind, you know. It's just that simple. You don't have to, you know, you don't have to complicate it, or you don't have to adopt all the rituals, you know. You just have to get in touch with your own true nature by working with your own breath. It opens up all kinds of levels of consciousness. Stan Groff, it takes people on hallucinatory journeys back to the beginning of their life and feeling rebirth simply by working with their breath. So the potential there is so untapped and so important, I think, to our individual sanity and our collective sanity. You know, because we're creating we are no longer in this scientific materialist world of objects. We are in the quantum world of awareness, of relations. Quantum worldview says there are no objects, there are no individuals, there are no things in the universe. There are only relations. That's what we've learned from quantum reality, right? And so this is a way of coming into awareness of that relational way of being, of existing. And once you're there and seeing yourself as a reference point for all that you formerly thought was other, then you know what to do. Then you become a spiritual cistern, like a alchemical potential, you know, cauldron, right, of awareness, and anything can bubble up in there, you know. But it's basically switching out of seeing things the way we've been conditioned to our whole lives as good consumers, objectifying and reifying. To get out of that, you have to keep reminding ourselves, no, I don't, everything exists relationally. Everything is an expression of relationship. And there's proper relationship and improper relationship. And unnatural relationship creates trauma. And coming into proper relationship is the way of recovering from trauma. So you see how that individual practice is related to the whole trauma sphere.
Yes.
We embody the whole thing. We come into that awareness that I am one with all that is living, that all that lives. that's Gaia. That's the beauty of it. That's where we're heading, is that level of awareness,
Yeah.
that partner relationship that will finally allow us to resolve this existential threat. Who knows what that's going to look like, but whoever gets there, this is how they're going to get there, right? And things will be different.
Yeah. Zhiwa, it's more than a pleasure to connect with you, and I so appreciate. I'm really glad that I took the risk to ask you that last question. That's particularly for me right on. I'm really moved by that response, and it so addresses what I again was sharing with you before we got going, that I'm having a difficult time just cracking myself open to hold some of the pieces of what's going on these days, and what you were just laying out. So simple, such a return to the sane core. And so I just appreciate you and your presence, and I'm really especially appreciating that you do tap in to that beingness, to that precious, authentic core, for your writing and for your speaking and for sharing today. And I really, if you don't mind, I'm definitely going to give you a call as we get closer to the election time, because my sense is we will have plenty to talk about.
Man, the world is changing so rapidly, and Caitlin Johnstone, I think, is one of my favorite columnists on Medium. She's Australian, and she had a recent column just about how everything is accelerating. It just keeps speeding up, and
it is,
and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
We need to take advantage of that and shapeshift the whole paradigm. That's basically what we're doing.
Absolutely a pleasure to spend time with you. Thank you so much. And I wish you just all the best as you shift into this next chapter of life. I can't wait. I can't wait to see what bubbles up through that.
Yeah, well, we all have to wait.
Okay.
Life is a waiting game sometimes. We've been waiting for a lot of things for a long time.
Yeah.
We have to be patient.
All right.
Patience is a virtue, right?
Yes, indeed. So they say.
Thank you so much for everything that you're doing, and the World Unity Week, everything that you're doing with that, and Peter, and it's really encouraging to see the kind of connections that are forming around the world right now, because they're absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
So
thank you, brother.
In my heart.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.